take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here's Reverend Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Blackwell. Let me say good morning, good evening, good afternoon, but certainly never good night and never ever goodbye. My name is Rev Nathaniel W Martin. I'm the pastor of the New Life Institutional Baptist Church here in sunny Southern California. And the name of our broadcast today is entitled It's Time, and it is always time for justice. And that justice must always address the inequities and the governmental promoted and aided and abetted inequities in the environment and in the living conditions of the people who are of a darker hue. And not only does there be justice in light of the environment, which is being depleted and destroyed by all of the emissions and various pollutants that are just plumed into our sky, and we have to breathe that stuff in. And not only are we breathing it, but it is coming to our attention that it is causing climate change all around the world. Although we have a great climate denier in charge in Washington, D.C., one may be entitled to one's own interpretation, but one is not entitled to one's own facts. And the facts are that the climate is changing. The water temperatures are warming up, and that is creating havoc all around the world. Justice must include economic justice, and under the heading of economic justice, we must always mention, talk about, and propound and support reparations for past crimes. First crime of the 12 colonies, of course, was their extermination of the people who were here when they got here. Yes, the people who Columbus termed Indians, although they had their own identities prior to their run-in with that privateer, that pirate, that homicidal maniac whom the world honors as Christopher Columbus. But the second one was even equally as great, and that was the crime, and that was the sin of chattel slavery as practiced in these 12 colonies. Yes, all 12 colonies, original colonies, were slave colonies. They all condoned slavery. They all had slaves in their midst, although it must be said in favor of Rhode Island, that Rhode Island did not sign the original Constitution that supported and condoned slavery. Of course, that's another story. The 244 to 250 years of unrequited toil, as the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was wont to extol upon, set a whole culture back. How far back? Well, all 250 years, because whereas we were working to make other folks wealthy, the other folks were getting wealthy at our expense, which means while we were constantly falling backwards or remaining where we were because we were not saving any money or earning any money or being paid any money as slaves, those who held us in bondage were getting rich. They were making a bank. Literally, they were starting banks. The stock exchange in New York City, all of that owes its present existence to slavery. Not only the banks, the bankers, the insurance industry that insured and underwrote the voyages of the various slave ships and subsequently insured the cargo being transported across the Atlantic. And after that cargo arrived here in the person of people who were formerly free, who were now found themselves kidnapped and in a hostile land, why we find that those same insurance companies wrote policies that benefited the slave owners, slave traders, the slave masters. They got rich off of the life, and then they got rich off of the death of the slaves. He always said it was cheaper to hire another nigger during those days, and I don't think that has really changed that much even now. But lest we become too morose, let us look at the Word of God as it relates to reparations, which is the purpose of our show. It says here in Deuteronomy chapter 15, beginning in verse 12, "And if thy brother, an Hebrew man or an Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year thou shalt let him or her go free from thee. And when thou sendest him or her out free from thee, thou shalt not let them go away empty." Verse 14, "Thou shalt furnish," note the word furnish, "them liberally out of thy flock, and out of thy floor, and out of thy winepress of that wherewith the Lord thy God has blessed thee, thou shalt give unto them." And so we find that the Bible never condoned chattel slavery, regardless of what defense was raised in the churches across the South and the North that condoned and supported and promoted and approved of slavery, knowing quite well that many of the pastors, bishops, vicars, preachers, and the like in that era were slaveholders and slave owners themselves. And so one always justifies one's sin. One always justifies one's crime. That doesn't make it right because you're able to justify it. Just because you may have better debating skills than your neighbor or even myself does not make you right. It just means that you may be able to prevail in your court filings, in your logic, because you use more, have better debating devices to bring to bear. But in God's eyesight, was slavery right? No, slavery was not right. Even though you find that in the Bible, the slave owners were wont to refer the slaves to the writings of Paul, so that verse that says, "Slaves, obey your masters." Of course, they were not so liberal in referring the slaves to the book of Genesis, where the children of Israel went down into Egypt land and were sold there and were held there as captives, but later were delivered. But the slaves had a song that said, "Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? And come on, deliver for me." Of course, I'm mixing my metaphors, but you get the point. Children of Israel were delivered from their Egyptian bondage. Daniel, who was himself a subject of a ruling power at a later time than the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, yet he found himself in legal troubles because of his faith and his belief in God. Do I have a witness? And don't think you can't get in legal trouble because of your beliefs. The devil is very much busy and active and knows all of the politicians and all of the bailiwicks and municipalities all across this great nation and around the world. He doesn't care whether you have a democracy or capitalism or communism or a parliamentary government. It doesn't matter. It's the same devil. It's the same evils in the same hearts of all people. And so therefore sin will always obtain. After all, Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden and messed up, got evicted, got kicked out. But I don't want to stray too far from my basic fundamentals that I'm dealing with on this broadcast, which is the support for reparations for past wrong, because black people are due those reparations. Yes, I believe in a central government. How did we get the railroads and all of the highways if not for the central government? How do we get the hospitals if not for centralized government? The people who talk about shrinking government, government is too big, it needs to be reduced, while most of those people were descendants of the slaveholders, slave owners, all across this nation. And when they spouted or speak about states' rights, they talk about states' rights as long as it is beneficial to their argument to keep one side up and the other side down. You've seen those arguments. You've read those arguments that were made all throughout the history of this nation. The very fact that the Constitution of the United States was written in order to form a more perfect union, but it represented a compromise between the states where there was no slavery and the states where slavery was very much in vogue. Some of the northern states began to shift their slave responsibilities to their southern climate brethren. And that is why when Abe Lincoln made his second inaugural address, he said the slaves were not equally spread across the several states, but they were concentrated in the southern climes. And but these southern climes held great sway in the Congress of the United States of America. Excuse me. Yeah. Well, ultimately, what became known as the Congress of the United States of America, although it started out as the Congress of the 13 Colonies, and proceeded from there in its various iterations to become what we have now. And I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, because some people want to have what they call a strict constitutional construction, and by that, I believe Clarence Thomas is in that category, in that club. They want to go back to the original meaning of "we the people," where the original meaning of "we the people" meant that only we, the landed owning, slave owning white people of the 13 colonies. It didn't include women, as Thurgood Marshall pointed out in his 1987 speech at the bicentennial. Slaves were left out, Indians were left out, white women were left out. White women didn't get the vote until 1920s. And so a strict construction of the Constitution is impossible in this current day and age. But yet you have those mindsets and those ideologies being expressed from the highest court in the land, the United States Supreme Court. No wonder there is such a confusion, such cognitive dissonance, which first began to be heard when the colonies accepted slavery. But yet they said they wanted to be a free and independent government. But yet they denied freedom and justice to the slaves, to the Negroes, not only in slavery, but afterwards as well. Which brings me to my current harangue for today, and that is that racism and white supremacy is always raising it's an ugly specter, and always raising an argument or positing a stereotype, one being that in the area of education, that black parents don't take as much interest in the education of their children, and black children take no interest in education. And I guess that is one of the reasons why the resources that we all contribute to pay for are more generally distributed in the, shall we say, the more well-to-do communities of our states, of all of the 50 states, than they are in the so-called poorer or less well-to-do communities. Although all communities, mind you, pay taxes. I pay property taxes, And my property taxes are used to help the schools up in Pacific Palisades, Rancho Palos Verdes estates, all across the state of California. But when it comes down to Fremont, not so much. Belmont, yes. Fremont, not so much. Gompers Junior High, not so much. And so these disparities are what leads some black parents to want to put their children in another school district where they would have a better chance at having an equal outcome in their learning and in their education. And I bring that up because of the fact that recently Miss Felicity Huffman, who you remember from Desperate Housewives, I forget the name of the character she played, but you've seen her on TV there. She was found out that she and her rich friends were using a game in the system, and they were using their influence and their accumulated wealth as power to get their children into good schools, into good positions at USC, and they were paying. And I believe she was paying $15,000 to have a proctor to correct her child's test scores so that the child would be able to pass the entrance exam there at USC. I say all of that because she was detected and caught up in a FBI sting that they call it. I believe I had it here before me, Varsity Blues or something like that, Blue Varsity. And as a result, here it is, the FBI's Operation Varsity Blues has undoubtedly shined a light on buying access to an elite education. No, but it is merely a high-profile and extreme example of the very common practice of people and communities of means hoarding educational opportunity and literally locking the door to those who want the exact same thing for their children but can't afford to buy it. And with the current debate on tuition, and there are those on both sides, and most vocal are those, of course, who profit by the system as it is. Always watch those who are the most vocal and see where their economic interests lie. And parents across America will be waiting forever if we allow ourselves to believe that the fat cats who live and educate their children behind walls of wealth will ever give up even an inch of their infinite advantage and privileges. They are so far removed from the pain and desperation that countless parents face every day that we can never expect the staggering educational inequality around them to even be on their radar, let alone see them join with poor families and raise up their voices in an effort to reverse it. Those with the most power and money in the educational feeding frenzy that defines America are never coming to save parents from broken schools, no matter how much they pretend they care when the cameras are rolling. Now, I didn't write that, but some very thoughtful journalists comparing the disparity between the treatment of Miss Felicity Huffman, the actress, and other parents, namely Tanya McDowell and Kelly Williams Bollard. Both of those were sentenced to prison, jail. They got felonies. They lost their jobs, all because they tried to send their children to a better school. One of the ladies was homeless, and yet this homeless woman was willing to sacrifice to see that her child got a better a better chance at getting a good education. But yet, we hear constantly mumbling out over the airways of our nation that black parents don't care about their children's education, when we have these stark, glaring contrasts, these examples of parents who were willing to go to jail to keep their kids, give their kids a good chance. And what about the Little Rock Nine? Although we're going back quite a ways to pick them up, but their parents were willing to endure the loss of jobs, the intimidation of their persons and of their families in order to give those children a chance to go to school to get a good education. Yes, black people know the value of education and treasure education, because we know education offers one of the best, not the only, but one of the best means of raising or rising up from one's social strata. When one is educated, then one has a chance. If that wasn't the truth, then why was it true that in slavery and the slaveocracy, it was against the law to educate a Negro slave, whether he be male or female, boy or girl? And matter of fact, it was upon under penalty of confiscation of property and sometimes death to the slave, and confiscation of treasure and property from the white person who was apprehended or detected teaching a Negro to read or to write. As a matter of fact, you check Frederick Douglass' narrative. He talks about how he had to sneak and learn how to learn his ABCs and to sound out words in the Bible, because it was illegal for Negroes to go to school. They're still trying to make it illegal for you to go to school. And the sooner that we see the nexus and the connection between those who put obstacles and impediments in the pathway of education now are in league, or analogous, I should say. That's a better word. They are analogous to those in the slaveocracy who said that if we catch a Negro learning to read or write, we're going to put him to death and bring all manner of penalties down upon the heads of those who have essayed to teach Negroes or slaves to learn to be educated. Now you compare that. Those are the facts, my friends. America has never wanted to educate its black children. Although its universities and colleges were started and owe their very existence to the slaves. Yes, to the slaves. Well, because of slavery, the slave owners were able to send their children to Yale and to Harvard and to William and Mary and all of that ilk, and to Brown University, those great universities all over this nation. Those universities were started because of the result of slavery, built as a result by slaves and because of slavery. And the education curriculum, the books, and all of the marvelous architectural structures that became the halls, and many of them still standing today, they stand on the shoulders of the former slaves. So they were built with slave money. Yes. If the slaves didn't directly lay hands on and build those buildings, although many of them did, the financing, which was the biggest part, was provided by the slaves themselves. I wish I had a witness. And so when we talk about the high cost of schooling from the kindergarten to the secondary level, well, we must realize that we are still confronted and dealing with the legacy of slavery. Mrs. Kelly Williams Bolar and Miss Tanya McDowell themselves are caught up in this irrational scheme that has prevailed all across this nation to hinder and to prevent the onward intellectual progress of black people in America. And to a lesser extent, I imagine even Mrs. Huffman is a victim of this same scheme. She has the privilege, because of being born what we call so-called white in America. She has the privilege to pull her children out of public school, put them in private school. She has the privilege, if she can afford it, to pay money, as she did, try to make it better for her kid. You know, that's because of the same system. Whereas if tuition was free, and if the standardized test was not so racist in its application, yes, racist, because the standardized test makers from the University of Texas on across this great nation, they all realized that with the impediments that were in the way of the black pupils, the black students, that the black 74% of black students would not pass the SAT because they never saw these type of subjects that are on the SAT or the ACT. That's what you call institutionalized racism. And that's why we continue to argue and fight about it and argue against it, and why you must become active and you must not be silent. And you on both sides of the spectrum must join in the fight for a better education for all children. And there must be no school that is inferior to any other school if we're going to have a level playing field. All of our schools must be up at the same level. All of our people must have access, not only access, but actually the advantage of that realization of that schooling. And so that is why we continue to fight for reparation. We must thank God this year, at least they're talking about free tuition. And at least this year they realize that separate is inherently still unequal. They're going back away from that no child left behind mantra, and going back to realizing that if Fremont is where it is, and Belmont is where it is, until you bring Fremont up to where Belmont is, you will always leave the other child behind, because if you teach them just to take the test, you don't benefit them. I must close. I agree again, tell you, my brothers and my sisters, in this 2019 era, that you're going to have to start working for yourself. You're going to start your own businesses, your own enterprises. You're going to have to pull yourself up by your own bootstrap. Why? Because the people that own these corporations and companies, they don't want to pay you. They want to keep all the money for themselves. They want to declare bankruptcy and leave you holding the bag. You ain't been paid in a year, and the guy that owned the business is out there riding in a yacht while you tied up in bankruptcy court. At the back end of the debtors. If anybody else gets paid, the people on the front end are going to get paid, and you on the back end going to get $5 later on. And you can't sit around and wait on that. I must say to you, therefore, as I've always said and continue to say, why it is one of Pastor Martin's philosophical plaudits that I apply, and I believe, and I continue to say, if you're working on this job and they're cutting your hours, cutting your pay, cutting your benefits, and don't ever show you no kind of appreciation. That little business about you sure is doing a good job. That ain't about nothing. Show me my appreciation in my paycheck. Remember, take it from me. I worked in the field for many, many years. Look, if you're working on a job and they don't want to pay you, what you need to do, realize you ain't no slave, and stop working for nothing. Don't work for them. God bless you. Thank you, Doc. We out.
All of my good days, outweigh my bad days. Yes, they do. I just say thank you, Lord.